The Tower of the Whispering Walls. At night, you can hear the voices. In the autumn of 1879, a shepherd named George Miller made a discovery that would forever change the peaceful village of Millbrook in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. High upon Raven's Peak, hidden among ancient pines and thick fog, stood a crumbling tower that had been there for centuries. The locals called it the Witch's Tower, though no one remembered why anymore. What George found on that foggy October morning was no fairy tale or legend. It was something far more terrible, something that would bring to light the truth about 200 years of silence and repression. The tower stood up there as if time had forgotten it. 30 meters high, it rose from the forest floor, its gray stones overgrown with moss. And at night, when the wind whistled through the broken windows, you could hear them, the voices, whispering, weeping, screaming voices that emanated from the depths of the stonework. Generations of villagers had heard these voices and covered their ears. They had forbidden their children to go near the tower. They had invented stories to hide the truth, but on this autumn day, the silence would end. The year 1879 was a time of upheaval in America. The nation was still recovering from the Civil War, and the country was striving for progress and modernity. Railroads connected cities, factories sprang up from the ground, and people looked optimistically to the future. But in the remote valleys of the White Mountains, where the shadows of the peaks fell long and dark, the old stories lived on. Stories of witches and demons, of missing children and cursed places. Millbrook was such a village. It lay hidden in a narrow valley, surrounded by dense forests and steep cliffs. 240 people lived here, most of them farmers, lumberjacks, and charcoal burners. The houses were built of dark wood, with low ceilings and small windows that let in little light in winter. The streets were unpaved and turned into muddy paths when it rained. The church, a simple stone building with a crooked steeple, was the only place where the village community regularly gathered. Above the village, at the highest point of Raven's Peak, loomed the tower. It was the oldest structure in the area, older than the church, older than the oldest house in the village. The records in the church archives mentioned it as early as 1612, but experts suspected it was much older, perhaps from the 15th century, perhaps even earlier. The tower had once been part of a larger fortification, but the other buildings had long since decayed and been reclaimed by nature. Only the tower still stood, defiant and indestructible, as if unwilling to release what was hidden within. The shape of the tower was unusual. It was not round like most defensive towers, but octagonal, with thick walls of gray granite. Each side was about 5 meters wide, and the walls were over 2 meters thick in some places. There were only a few windows, all narrow like arrow slits, and they were located exclusively in the upper floors. The ground floor had no windows, only a heavy oak door so weathered that one could no longer tell whether it had ever had fittings or a lock. But what made the tower truly disturbing were the sounds. Everyone in the village knew them. On quiet nights, when the wind was weak and fog hung over the valleys, you could hear them. At first, just a soft whisper, like voices in the distance. Then they became louder, clearer. Sometimes they sounded like prayers, sometimes like lamentations, sometimes like desperate screams. The villagers had learned to ignore these sounds, to burrow under their blankets and pretend they heard nothing. No one went to the tower at night. No one dared to go near it, even during the day, without good reason. Parents told their children that the Witch of the White Mountains lived up there, an evil creature who stole small children and boiled them in her cauldron. The stories varied in details, but the core was always the same. The tower was a place of evil, and whoever came too close would meet a terrible fate. George Miller was 37 years old in the autumn of 1879. He was a stocky man with a weathered face and strong hands that had been accustomed to hard work all his life. George came from a family of shepherds who had worked the steep slopes around Millbrook for generations. He knew every path, every rock, every tree in these mountains. And he also knew the stories about the tower, for his grandmother had told them to him when he was still a little boy. On that October morning, George drove his sheep up Raven's Peak to a pasture he hadn't used in years. The summer had been dry, and the grass in the lower elevations was grazed down. He needed fresh pasture land for his flock, and the old meadow below the tower was the only option left to him. George was not a superstitious man. He didn't believe in witches or ghosts. For him, the sounds at the tower were nothing more than wind and birdsong, amplified by the acoustics of the old walls. The fog hung particularly thick among the trees that morning. George could barely see 10 meters ahead, and the world around him was wrapped in a milky gray. His sheep followed him obediently up the narrow path, their bells ringing softly in the quiet morning air. The forest was unusually silent. No birds sang, no wind rustled through the leaves. Only the crunching of George's boots on the damp forest floor and the occasional bleating of his sheep broke the silence. When George reached the clearing where the tower stood, he stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. The sheep sensed it too. They became restless, huddled together, and didn't want to go further. George had to drive them with his staff to get them to spread out on the meadow. But even then, they remained nervous, repeatedly glancing toward the tower and pawing with their hooves. George had often seen the tower from a distance, but he hadn't been this close since his childhood. Now, in the thick fog, the structure seemed even more threatening than in his memory. The gray stone walls seemed to rise out of nowhere, as if they were not part of this world. The narrow windows stared at him like empty eye sockets. And then George noticed something that made his blood freeze. The tower's door stood open. Not wide, just a crack, but definitely open. George was absolutely certain that the door had been firmly locked during his last visit 30 years ago. He remembered how he had tried to push it open as a boy, without success. Now it hung crooked on its rusty hinges, and through the crack seeped a strange, musty air. George knew he should turn back. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to gather his sheep and run down the mountain as fast as possible. But another voice in his head was stronger. The voice of curiosity. The voice that wanted to know what was inside. The voice that wanted to leave all those years of fear and superstition behind. He stepped closer to the door. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed it against the weathered wood. The door swung open with a long creak, and a blast of cold, damp air struck George. The smell was overwhelming. A mixture of mold, decay, and something else. Something he couldn't identify. Something that triggered alarm deep within him. The ground floor of the tower was a single large chamber, about 10 meters in diameter. Through the open door, enough light fell in to make out the rough outlines. The floor consisted of large stone slabs, many of which were broken or displaced. On the walls hung rusty iron chains, some as thick as George's arm. In the center of the room stood a kind of stone table or altar, covered with stains that looked almost black in the dim light. But what really made George freeze were the symbols on the walls. They were carved into the stone, some deep, some barely visible, but all executed with obsessive precision. They were crosses, but upside down, pentagrams, strange geometric patterns that reminded George of nothing he had ever seen. And in between, in an antiquated script he could barely decipher, were words and sentences engraved. Latin words, prayers perhaps, or incantations. George stepped further into the room, even though every fiber of his body told him to flee. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and he began to recognize more details. In one corner lay a pile of rotted fabric remnants, perhaps the remains of clothing or blankets. Next to it stood earthen jugs, broken and covered with cobwebs. Against one wall leaned a long, rusty iron rod, whose purpose George didn't want to guess. Then he saw the stairs. They were on the opposite wall, a narrow spiral staircase made of stone that led to the upper floors. The first steps were still visible. Then the stairs disappeared into darkness. And from that darkness came a sound. At first it was so quiet that George thought he had imagined it. A whisper. No, several whispers overlapping, like a chorus of invisible voices. George couldn't understand individual words, but the sound was clearly human, and it came from above, from the depths of the tower. The hair on George's neck stood up. His hands became clammy. His heart began to race. These were not wind sounds. This was not acoustics. These were voices. Real, human voices. But how could that be? The tower had been abandoned for decades. No one lived up here. No one ever came here. George took a step toward the stairs, then another. His reason screamed at him to leave, but his feet didn't obey. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him upward, deeper into the darkness of the tower. The whispering voices became louder, more urgent. They seemed to be calling him, luring him. He placed his foot on the first step, the second, the third. The spiral staircase was narrow, the ceiling low. George had to duck his head to avoid hitting his head on the vault. The light from below barely reached him, and with each step it became darker. The whispering voices now filled the entire staircase, coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. After 20 steps, George reached a small platform. From here, a low door led into the first upper floor. The door was made of wood, but not weathered like the entrance door. It looked almost new, as if someone had recently replaced it. A heavy padlock hung on the door, gleaming dully in the dim light. George tried to rattle the door, but it didn't give an inch. The lock was firmly secured. He knocked on the wood and listened. The whispering voices suddenly became quieter, as if the invisible speakers fell silent in shock. Then, after a long pause, came a new sound. A scratching. Slow, methodical, like fingernails on wood. The scratching came from the other side of the door. Directly in front of him, only a few centimeters away, was something, or someone. George felt his knees go weak. Sweat ran down his forehead, despite the cold in the tower. His breath came quick and shallow. He forced himself to continue up the stairs. Maybe there was an explanation above. Maybe everything wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe his imagination was just playing tricks on him. That's what he told himself anyway, as his legs mechanically took one step after another. The second upper floor also had a locked door. Here the lock was older, rusted, but still secure. Behind this door the whispering voices were loudest. George could now pick out individual words, though he didn't understand their meaning. It sounded like an old language, perhaps Latin, perhaps something even older. The voices were female and male, old and young, all mixed together, as if dozens of people were speaking at once. George laid his ear against the door. The voices immediately became quieter, as if the speakers could sense his presence. Then, quite suddenly, silence. An absolute, oppressive silence that was heavier than any noise. George hardly dared to breathe. And then he heard it, quite clearly, very close, right on the other side of the door. A single voice, a woman's voice, old and brittle. She spoke in English, but in a dialect that George barely understood. The words were slow and clear, as if the speaker wanted to make sure he understood every word. Go, away from, here, before, it's too late. George tore himself away from the door, stumbled backward, and almost lost his balance on the narrow stairs. His heart was pounding so loud he thought it must be audible throughout the tower. This was too much. This couldn't be real, but it was real. He had heard the voice. He had understood the words. He ran down the stairs as fast as he could in the darkness. His shoulder hit the stone wall. His feet slipped on the smooth steps. But he didn't stop until he was back on the ground floor, until the daylight reached him. until he burst out the door and into the foggy morning air. His sheep had gathered at the edge of the clearing, as far from the tower as possible. They bleated anxiously as George ran back to them. He herded them together without paying attention to the usual commands and chased them down the mountain, back to the village, back to civilization, back to safety. But George Miller knew he couldn't simply go home and pretend nothing had happened. He had heard something impossible, something terrible, and he knew he had to tell someone. The silence that had lain over the tower for generations had to be broken. But what George didn't know, as he ran down the mountain, was that his discovery was only the beginning. The truth about the Tower of the Whispering Walls was far darker, far more cruel than anything he could have imagined in his worst nightmares. If this story has already captivated you, leave me a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more creepy stories from America. And remember, the truth is often more frightening than any fiction. But let's continue, because what George found out next would change the village of Millbrook forever. George Miller reached the village around noon, completely out of breath and with wide eyes. He had hastily driven his sheep into the pen and then went directly to the house of the village pastor. Pastor Augustine Keller was a man of 62 years who had been caring for the small community of Millbrook for over 30 years. He was known for his scholarship and his extensive library, which contained books on theology, history, and even some old manuscripts about the legends of the White Mountains. When George pounded on the heavy wooden door of the parsonage, Keller opened it himself. The old priest wore his usual black cassock, and his bushy white eyebrows drew together when he saw the distraught state of his visitor. "George, what happened? You look like you've seen the devil himself." The choice of words couldn't have been more appropriate. George entered the house, and as soon as the door closed behind him, the words burst out of him. He told of his visit to the tower, of the open door, of the symbols on the walls, of the whispering voices, and the woman who had spoken to him. Pastor Keller listened in silence, his face growing paler with each word. When George was finished, the pastor sat down heavily on a chair. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them over his face. "I had hoped this day would never come," he murmured. "I had hoped that the secret would die with me." "What secret?" asked George. "What do you know about the tower?" Pastor Keller slowly stood up and went to a large cabinet on the wall. He pulled a key from his pocket and opened the bottom compartment. There, dusty and yellowed, lay old documents and books. The pastor pulled out a particularly thick book, whose leather binding was brittle and cracked. On the cover, in faded golden script, it read, "Chronicon Montium Alborum," the Chronicle of the White Mountains. "This book," Keller began in a quiet voice, "was written in the year 1618 by my predecessor, Pastor Matthias Brennan. It contains records of events that took place in this region, events so terrible that the church decided to keep them secret. Every pastor who comes to Millbrook learns of this book and swears an oath never to speak of its contents. Until now, I have kept that oath." He opened the book, and the old pages rustled. The writing was in an old-fashioned English script that George could barely read. Pastor Keller began to translate as his fingers glided over the lines. "The tower on Raven's Peak was erected in the year of our Lord 1487 by Aldrich Blackwood, the lord over these lands. It was the time of the great witch hunts, and Aldrich had made a name for himself as a zealous persecutor of heretics and alleged witches. The tower served as his personal inquisition center, a place where he interrogated, tortured, and executed those he accused of witchcraft." Pastor Keller paused and swallowed hard. But Aldrich Blackwood was no ordinary inquisitor. He was a man obsessed with dark arts, with magic, and demonology. He didn't really believe that his victims were witches. No, he used the witch hunt as a pretext to capture people and abuse them for his own perverse experiments. George felt sick. What kind of experiments? The pastor flipped further through the book. Aldrich believed that the human soul does not end with death, but can be bound to places. He developed rituals, based on ancient pagan practices and twisted Christian prayers, to bind the souls of his victims to the tower. He believed that he could thus create an army of spirits that would serve him. The whispering voices you heard, George, that's them. The souls of over 200 men, women, and children who were tortured and murdered in this tower between 1487 and 1522. The number made George freeze. 200 people in this one tower. That's impossible. Is it? Pastor Keller looked at him seriously. You heard the voices yourself. You saw the symbols on the walls. These are no fairy tales, George. This is our history. A history we would rather have forgotten. What happened to Aldrich Blackwood? In the year 1522, he was finally stopped by his own people. The villagers and some brave priests stormed the tower and found there, well, the records speak of scenes too cruel to describe in detail even for that brutal time. Aldrich was killed on the spot. His body burned. The fortification was razed, but the tower proved indestructible. Every attempt to tear it down failed. Tools broke, workers became sick, or died under mysterious circumstances. So, it was decided to seal the tower. The doors were walled up, the stairs were supposed to be made impassable, and the church declared the building cursed and forbidden. But the door was open, said George, and the upper floors are locked with new locks. Someone was there. Someone has reopened the tower. Pastor Keller's face became even paler. That means someone has broken the seals. Someone has gained access to the upper floors, where, according to the records, the worst atrocities took place, where Aldrich performed his rituals, where the souls are most strongly bound. At that moment there was a loud knock at the door. Both men flinched. Pastor Keller went to the door and opened it a crack. Outside stood Mayor Frederick Woodman, a massive man of 50 years with a red face and heavy breathing. Pastor Keller, you must come immediately. Something terrible has happened. The three men hurried through the narrow alleys of the village to the house of the Miller family. A crowd had already gathered there, whispering with anxious faces. When the pastor and the mayor made their way through, George saw what was causing the commotion. 14-year-old Elizabeth Miller lay on a bed in the main room of the house. Her parents were kneeling beside her, weeping. The girl was conscious, but her condition was frightening. Her skin was chalk white, her eyes wide open and staring. From her mouth came a constant stream of words, but they were not in English. It was Latin, fluent, perfect Latin, spoken in a pitch that was not the girl's. It sounded like an old woman, rough and brittle. Pastor Keller stepped closer to the bed. His hands trembled as he pulled his cross from his pocket. He began to speak a prayer, but before he could say more than a few words, Elizabeth Miller sat up abruptly. Her head turned at an unnatural angle, and she stared directly at the pastor. "Augustine Keller," said the voice from the girl's mouth, "you know us. You have read about us. We are the forgotten, the tortured, the bound. For 400 years we have screamed, but no one hears us. For 400 years we suffer, but no one helps us. Now the time has come. The seal is broken. The doors are open. And soon we will be free." Elizabeth Miller's eyes rolled back, and she fell back onto the bed. The voice fell silent. The girl breathed shallowly. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were still forming words that no one could hear. The girl's mother, Mrs. Miller, a gaunt woman with tear-stained face, clung to the pastor. "What's wrong with my daughter? What does she have? Since last night she's been like this. She speaks in foreign tongues. She says things she can't know. Please, help her." "When did this start?" asked Pastor Keller. "Last night, around midnight. She had a nightmare and woke up screaming. Since then, she's not herself. It's as if someone else is in her." George stepped forward. "Last night? That was after the tower door was opened. There must be a connection." Pastor Keller nodded slowly. Yes, the opening of the tower has released something. The bound souls are seeking ways to manifest. And this young girl, innocent and sensitive, was an easy target for them. What can we do? Asked Mayor Woodman. The pastor turned to the mayor, and in his eyes was a determination that George had never seen in the old man. We must go to the tower. We must find out who broke the seals and why. And then we must find a way to free the souls before more people are afflicted. To the tower? Woodman backed up a step. That's madness. No one goes to the tower. We have no choice anymore, said Keller firmly. If we do nothing, this will spread. One girl is already afflicted. Tomorrow it could be 2. The day after 10. The whole village could be possessed by these restless spirits. We must act now. George felt his stomach tighten, but he knew the pastor was right. I'll come, he said, though every fiber of his body protested. I was already there. I know the way. Pastor Keller laid a hand on George's shoulder. Thank you, my son. We'll need more men, brave men who are willing to face what lurks in that tower. Mayor Woodman sighed heavily. I'll gather volunteers, but I tell you most will be afraid. The tower, everyone here, knows the stories. Then it's time for the stories to end, said Pastor Keller, and for the truth to come to light. Within 2 hours, Mayor Woodman had assembled a group of 7 men who were willing to enter the tower. Besides George and the pastor, there was the mayor himself, the blacksmith Henry Brenner, the hunter Carl Smith, the innkeeper Otto Falk, and the young teacher John Beck. Each man carried a torch and a weapon, whether a hunting rifle, a knife, or a club. They met in front of the church, as the sun was already low in the sky. The autumn afternoon was cool, and the shadows grew longer. Pastor Keller had brought, in addition to his cross, an old Bible bound in black leather, as well as a vessel of holy water. Before we go, said the pastor, I want you all to understand what we're doing. We're not just going into an old tower. We're entering a place that has been permeated for centuries by pain, suffering, and dark magic. The souls trapped there are desperate, angry, and dangerous. They will try to confuse us, to frighten us, perhaps even to hurt us. But we must not forget, they were once people like us, victims of cruel tyranny. They deserve our help, not our fear. The men nodded, though George could see naked fear in their faces. He was sure his own face looked no different. The climb to the tower took an hour. The fog was back, thicker than in the morning, transforming the forest into a ghostly landscape of shadows and silhouettes. The group walked in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The only sounds were the crunching of their boots on the forest floor and the occasional crack of a twig. When they reached the clearing, the sun had already set. The tower loomed before them, a black mass against the dark gray sky. The door still stood open, a dark maw that seemed to invite them to enter and never look back. Pastor Keller lit his torch, and the others followed his example. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the stone walls of the tower. The pastor stepped first across the threshold, holding his cross before him. The others followed him hesitantly. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than in the morning. The air was so cold that the men could see their breath as white clouds. The musty smell had become stronger, mixed with something sweetish, putrid. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in the torchlight, as if they had a life of their own. My God, whispered John Beck, the young teacher. These are satanic symbols. I've read about them in books, but I never thought. Concentrate, said Pastor Keller sharply. We're here to fulfill a task. The upper floors are sealed, George said. We must find a way to open the locks. Henry Brenner, the blacksmith, stepped to the stairs. Give me light, he said. George held his torch closer as Brenner climbed the steps. They could hear him rattling the first door, then a metallic clinking as he worked on the lock. At that moment, the whispering voices began. They came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the air. A chorus of hundreds of voices speaking, weeping, screaming simultaneously. The men covered their ears, but the voices still penetrated. Otto Falk, the innkeeper, a normally robust man, sank to his knees. I can't. This is too much. Pastor Keller began to pray loudly, his voice fighting against the whispering voices. Lord, protect us from evil. Give us the strength to find the truth and bring peace. The whispering became louder, transformed into a howling, a deafening noise that seemed to tear the air itself. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more frightening than the noise. From the darkness of the stairs came Henry Brenner's voice, trembling and thin. I did it. The door is open. The men looked at each other. Each of them wanted to flee. Each of them sensed the danger lurking in this tower. But they also knew they had no choice. The fate of Elizabeth Miller and perhaps the entire village depended on what they found here. George forced himself to climb the stairs. The others followed him slowly. When they reached the first platform, they saw the open door leading into a dark room. Henry Brenner stood beside it, his face ashen in the torchlight. I don't know if we should go in there, he said. Pastor Keller stepped forward and raised his torch high. The light fell into the room beyond and revealed a sight that would haunt each of them for the rest of their lives. The room was covered with bones, human bones, neatly stacked along the walls like firewood. In the center of the room stood a large stone table, its surface grooved with deep channels leading to a hole in the middle. The table was stained with something that must once have been blood, but had now dried to a black, sticky substance. On the walls hung iron cages, just large enough to imprison the person, but too small to move in. In some of these cages were still the remains of skeletons, twisted in grotesque positions, as if they had tried to free themselves. But the most terrible thing was the walls themselves. They were covered with writing endless lines of words and sentences, carved into the stone with obsessive precision. Most were in Latin, but some were in English, in an archaic language that was hard to understand. John Beck, the teacher, stepped closer to the wall and began to read. His voice trembled. These are records. Aldrich Blackwood documented what he did here. Every victim, every ritual, he wrote it all down. Pastor Keller laid his hand on the young man's shoulder. Read on. We need to know what he did if we want to undo it. Beck forced himself to continue reading, though his voice kept breaking. He speaks of binding souls. He believed that through extreme torture and special rituals, a person's soul could be bound to a place. He used the fear and suffering of his victims to enslave them, not their body, but their soul, even after death. How can we free them? Asked George. Beck read on, his eyes flying over the endless lines. Here's something about dissolving the binding. He says the binding can only be broken if the source of power is destroyed. The source of power? Pastor Keller frowned. What does he mean by that? He speaks of an object, something he used for the rituals. A focus for the dark energy. Without this object, the binding would weaken and eventually break. Where is this object? Asked Mayor Woodman. Beck shook his head. It doesn't say here, but he mentions that it's kept in the uppermost room of the tower, in his personal chamber. The men looked at each other. They were now on the first upper floor. There were at least 2 more floors above them, maybe more. And if the first floor was already this horrific, what would they find further up? Carl Smith, the hunter, a man who had spent his life hunting and killing wild animals, and who was intimidated by little, shook his head. I don't know if I can go further up. This here, it surpasses everything I've ever seen. We must, said Pastor Keller with a firm voice. If we turn back now, everything was in vain. Elizabeth Miller and all others who might yet be afflicted are depending on us. George nodded, though his whole body trembled. The pastor is right. We've come this far. We can't give up now. The group left the bone room and continued up the spiral staircase. The steps were steeper and narrower here, and the men had to support themselves on the wall to avoid losing their balance. The torches cast flickering shadows that danced on the stone walls like ghostly figures. When they reached the second upper floor, they found another locked door. Henry Brenner set to work again, but this lock was stronger than the first. He needed almost 20 minutes, while the others waited nervously, and every sound made them jump. While they waited, the whispering voices began again, but this time they were different. They weren't chaotic or angry. They sounded pleading, begging, as if the trapped souls were imploring them to continue, to help them, to free them. "Do you hear that?" whispered Otto Falk. They're asking us for help." "Yes," Pastor Keller answered quietly. "They've been waiting 400 years for this chance. We must not disappoint them." Finally, the lock gave way with a loud click. Henry Brenner pushed the door open, and an icy gust of wind struck them. This room was different from the first. It was larger, about 15 meters in diameter, with a high vaulted ceiling. The floor was made of polished stone slabs, into which a huge pentagram was engraved. At the 5 points of the pentagram stood iron pillars, each about 2 meters high, with chains hanging from their tops. In the center of the pentagram stood a large chair, almost like a throne, carved from black wood and decorated with strange symbols. The chair was positioned so that the person sitting on it could see all 5 pillars. "This was his observation room," said John Beck with a choked voice. From here, he watched the rituals. The victims were chained to the pillars, and he sat here and enjoyed their suffering. The men stepped cautiously into the room. Their steps echoed on the stone slabs. As George stepped closer to one of the pillars, he saw that the chains were fitted with small, sharp barbs that would have dug into the prisoner's skin. At the foot of the pillar lay bones, small bones, children's bones. George turned away and gagged, but he forced himself to continue. They had to reach the uppermost floor. They had to find the object that held these souls captive. The spiral staircase led further up, narrower and darker than before. The air became thinner, harder to breathe. The torches flickered, as if oxygen were running low. After another 30 steps, they reached a final door. This one was not locked. It stood half open, as if someone had recently used it. Pastor Keller pushed the door open with the tip of his crucifix. It swung open silently and revealed a room that even today, in the year 1879, looked as if it were regularly used. This was Aldrich Blackwood's personal chamber, and it was remarkably well preserved. A large bed with decaying curtains stood against one wall. A massive desk of dark wood was cluttered with books, parchments, and strange instruments. On the walls hung portraits showing a man in dark clothing, with sharp features and eyes that radiated a frightening intensity even in the yellowed painting. But the most striking thing in this room was the altar on the opposite wall. It was made of black marble, artfully carved with depictions of demons and twisted human figures. And on this altar, on a cushion of rotted velvet, lay an object that threw ominous sparks in the torchlight. It was a chalice. A large chalice made of a material that looked like gold, but was darker, almost black, with golden veins. The rim of the chalice was set with gemstones that glittered in dirty shades of red. But the strangest thing was the engravings on the chalice. They moved, not strongly, not obviously, but if you looked closely, you could see how the symbols and lines slowly crawled across the surface like worms under skin. "That's it," whispered Pastor Keller. "That's the source." As the group approached the altar, they felt a force emanating from the chalice. It wasn't a physical force, but something subtler, darker. A presence that tried to penetrate their thoughts, nourish their fears, undermine their willpower. "We must destroy it," said George. "Immediately." Pastor Keller nodded. "Henry, your hammer. Can you?" Before the blacksmith could answer, The air around them exploded into chaos of noise and wind. The whispering voices transformed into screams, so loud that the men had to cover their ears. The torches all extinguished simultaneously, and the room was plunged into absolute darkness. Then, in the center of the room, appeared a light. Not a warm, inviting light, but a cold, pale glow like the light of a full moon. And in this light materialized a figure. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in the fashion of the 15th century. His face was pale as parchment. His eyes were black holes. But there was no doubt who he was. The portraits on the walls had shown him. Aldrich Blackwood. "How dare you?" said the apparition in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves. "Defile my sanctuary. How dare you lay your unworthy hands on my work?" Pastor Keller raised his crucifix, his hand trembling, but his voice firm. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to depart. You have no more power over these souls." The figure laughed, a terrible hollow sound. "Priest, always they believe their symbols and prayers can stand against true power. But I tell you, I am stronger than your God. I have discovered the secret of immortality. These souls are my property for all eternity." George felt his legs give way. The presence of this apparition was overwhelming, crushing. But then he heard something. The whispering voices. They had become quieter, not threatening, but encouraging, as if the trapped souls were encouraging him. With an effort of will he hadn't thought possible, George forced himself to approach the altar. The apparition turned to him, and George felt an invisible hand reaching for him, trying to hold him back. "You dare not!" screamed the figure of Aldrich. "Oh yes," gasped George. He grabbed the chalice, and immediately a burning pain shot through him, as if he were touching glowing metal. But he didn't let go. With all the strength he could muster, he lifted the chalice above his head and hurled it to the ground. The chalice shattered on the stone slabs, with a sound like breaking glass, mixed with a deafening scream. The apparition of Aldrich became translucent, his form dissolving into mist. His scream became louder and louder, until it finally fell silent. At that moment, everything changed. The cold disappeared from the air. The oppressive feeling of malevolence that had filled the tower dissolved like morning mist in the Sunday. And the whispering voices, they were no more. Instead, there was silence. A peaceful, natural silence. The torches reignited themselves, and their warm light filled the room. The men looked around, confused and exhausted. The chalice lay in 1,000 pieces on the floor, and from the cracks rose a white mist that slowly dissolved in the air. Is it over?" asked Otto Falk with a trembling voice. Pastor Keller knelt down and carefully touched one of the chalice fragments. It was cold, but not painful. Just a piece of metal, nothing more. "Yes," he said quietly, "it's over. The binding is broken. The souls are free." George sank to his knees, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Tears ran down his cheeks, but he didn't know if they were from fear, relief, or simply exhaustion. The group left the tower at dawn. They had spent the entire night up there, though it had seemed like an eternity to them. As they stepped out the door, the sun was just rising, and its golden light drove away the last shadows of the night. The tower itself looked somehow different, not less old or decayed, but emptier, as if it had cast off a burden it had carried for 400 years. When they returned to the village, they were met by a group of worried villagers. "Mrs. Miller," rushed to Pastor Keller. "My daughter Elizabeth has woken up. She's herself again. Whatever you did, it worked." The relief in the group was palpable. They had done it. The torment was over. In the following weeks, things in Millbrook slowly returned to normal. Elizabeth Miller recovered completely, though she had no memory of the time she had been possessed. The nightmares that many villagers had suffered from stopped, and the whispering voices from Raven's Peak fell silent forever. Pastor Keller wrote a detailed report of the events and added it to the Chronicle of the White Mountains. He ended his report with the words, "May this story serve as a warning that evil, no matter how deeply buried, must never be forgotten. Only through courage and truth can we overcome the shadows of the past." The tower on Raven's Peak still stands today, but it's no longer the witch's tower, the place of terror. The villagers now call it the Tower of Liberation. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows through the mountains, you can sometimes still hear voices, but they're no longer whispering voices. They're songs, joyful songs of souls who have finally found peace.